Have you ever stopped to think about what it truly means to hold a secret so profound, so sacred, that speaking it aloud could unravel the faith of millions? What would it do to a man's soul to carry such knowledge? Not as a scholar, not as a priest, but as someone the world considered property. Tonight I need you to sit with me through something uncomfortable, something that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the holiest site in Islam, about the men who served there in chains, and about the particular silence that history has wrapped around their stories, like a burial shroud. This is not a tale you will find in textbooks. This is not something your teachers ever mentioned. What I am about to share with you has been deliberately erased, tucked away in crumbling Ottoman archives and whispered only among those families who still remember. His name was Bilal ibn Musa. And before this night is over, you will understand why powerful men wanted his name forgotten, and why we must ensure it never is. If this kind of hidden history matters to you, if you believe some stories are too important to let die, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what comes next, there is no going back once you hear it. Are you ready? The wind that sweeps through Mecca today carries no memory of him. The pilgrims who circle the Kaaba in their millions, dressed in white, their lips moving with prayers older than empires, step upon stones that once knew the weight of his bare feet. Nobody tells them. Nobody has told them for over 200 years. But the stones remember. If you were to visit the Grand Mosque today, to stand in the shadow of that ancient black cube draped in gold-embroidered silk, you would see attendants moving quietly through the crowds. They wear specific garments. They carry ceremonial keys. They are respected, even revered for their proximity to holiness itself. What you would not see, what no one alive today has seen, is the other kind of servant. The kind that carried no keys because they themselves were locked property. The kind that knew every crack in every sacred stone, every hidden chamber beneath the marble floors, every whispered conversation that powerful men believed had died in the desert air. Bilal ibn Musa was one of these invisible witnesses. Born somewhere in the lands that Europeans would later carve into Sudan, stolen as a child from a village whose name he would eventually forget, sold across the Red Sea to traders who specialized in a particular commodity. Young African boys destined for sacred servitude in the holy cities of Arabia. They called them different names depending on their function. Some became household servants. Some became soldiers. Some, the most trusted and the most thoroughly broken, became guardians of the sacred. At the age of 12, Bilal ibn Musa passed through the gates of Mecca for the first time. His feet were bleeding. His tongue had forgotten how to form the words of his mother's language. His eyes, however, remained open. They would stay open for the next 37 years. What those eyes witnessed in the sacred precincts of the holiest mosque in Islam, the conversations overheard between Ottoman officials and local emirs, the financial arrangements made in the shadow of the Kaaba itself, the theological disputes that would have sparked wars had they reached common ears, the secret rituals performed by the elite that no pilgrim was ever permitted to observe. All of this accumulated in the mind of a man who was never supposed to have a mind at all. They taught him to be invisible. They succeeded too well. So invisible did Bilal become that the powerful forgot he was there. They spoke freely in his presence about matters that would have cost free men their heads. They conducted transactions, made accusations, revealed truths that contradicted the very doctrines they enforced upon the masses. And Bilal listened. Bilal remembered. Bilal waited. The year 1801 would change everything, not just for Bilal ibn Musa, but for the carefully constructed reality that the guardians of Mecca had maintained for generations. Forces were converging on the holy city that would tear apart the comfortable arrangements of centuries. The Wahhabi warriors were gathering in the desert, their fundamentalist fury aimed at what they considered the corruptions of the sacred sites. The Ottoman Empire, weakened and distracted by European pressures, was losing its grip on the distant provinces, and within the walls of the Grand Mosque itself, a slave who had been invisible for nearly 4 decades was about to become the most dangerous man in Arabia. But to understand what Bilal did, and why, we must first understand the world that created him. If you want to follow more cases like this, that shake all of society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. The Mecca of 1801 bore little resemblance to the gleaming metropolis of today. Picture instead a walled city of perhaps 30,000 souls, crammed into a narrow valley between barren mountains that seemed to lean inward, as if listening. The buildings were mostly stone and mud brick, rising 3 and 4 stories high to compensate for the limited space within the walls. Wooden balconies protruded over narrow streets, where the sun penetrated only at midday, and even then reluctantly. The smell was particular, incense from 100 different lands mixing with camel dung, cooking fires, the sweat of pilgrims who had crossed deserts and oceans to reach this place. At the center of everything stood the Grand Mosque, not the vast complex of today, but something older, more intimate, more suffocating. The Kaaba rose within its courtyard like a dark heart, draped in the kiswa, the black silk covering embroidered with Quranic verses in gold thread. 7 times each day the faithful circled this structure, their bare feet wearing grooves into the marble that had been laid and relaid over centuries. They believed, these pilgrims, that they walked where Abraham had walked, where Muhammad had prayed, where the very gates of heaven touched the earth. What they did not see, what they were never permitted to see, was everything that happened outside the ritual hours. The Grand Mosque was more than a place of worship. It was a financial institution of staggering complexity. The donations that flowed into its coffers from across the Islamic world could have purchased kingdoms: gold from West Africa, silver from India, gems from Persia, silk from China. All of this accumulated in chambers beneath the mosque that only a handful of men ever entered. The administration of these treasures required an army of functionaries, accountants, guards, and servants. The servants were, almost without exception, enslaved Africans. They called them agas, a term that carried different meanings depending on context. In the Ottoman courts, an aga might be a military commander or a eunuch of high rank. In Mecca, the agas of the haram, the agas of the sacred precinct, were something else entirely. They were property, yes, castrated as children and trained from youth in the specific duties of sacred service. But within the confines of the mosque, they wielded a strange and terrible power. They alone knew where certain documents were stored. They alone remembered which keys opened which locks. They alone could navigate the labyrinthine passages beneath the mosque where ancient relics and forbidden texts were said to be hidden. Bilal ibn Musa was not born to this system. He was made by it. The process of making an aga began with the knife. Somewhere in the Egyptian desert, in facilities specifically designed for this purpose, young African boys purchased from slavers underwent the operation that would define their existence. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Some historians suggest fewer than 1 in 3 survived the procedure and its aftermath. Those who lived were considered marked by divine favor, chosen vessels for sacred service. Their wounds were dressed with oil and sand. Their screams were answered with prayers. Bilal survived. He would carry the scar of that survival every day of his remaining life, a physical reminder that he was no longer entirely human in the eyes of the law, yet somehow more than human in the eyes of the sacred. After months of recovery, the survivors were transported to Mecca or Medina, depending on where servants were needed. Bilal was assigned to the Grand Mosque. He was given new clothes, white during working hours, dark gray when he was permitted to leave the sacred precinct. He was given a sleeping mat in a chamber he shared with 11 other boys. He was given a new name, though he would secretly preserve the name his mother had given him, repeating it silently each night before sleep, so that some part of him would remain his own. And he was given duties. At first, the duties were simple: carrying water, sweeping floors, holding torches while senior agas conducted their rounds through the underground chambers. Gradually, as he proved his reliability and his silence, more complex tasks were assigned. He learned to prepare the special oils used to polish the Kaaba's silver corner. He learned to repair the kiswa when desert winds tore its delicate fabric. He learned the locations of the 73 keys that controlled access to every significant chamber in the mosque complex. He learned which officials could be trusted and which could be bribed. He learned, most importantly, to see everything and say nothing. By the time Bilal was 30 years old, he had become what the senior agas called a shadow of the sacred. He moved through the most restricted areas of the Grand Mosque with an authority that required no explanation, Guards stepped aside when he approached. Doors opened before his hand could touch them. He knew secrets that the Sharif of Mecca himself did not know. The true accounting of the treasury, the actual contents of sealed relics that pilgrims venerated from a distance, the private vices of pious men who thundered against sin from their pulpits. And he knew other things. Things that had been whispered in his presence because no one believed a slave could understand classical Arabic, let alone remember it. Things about the history of the Kaaba itself that contradicted official doctrine. Things about the political arrangements that kept Ottoman, Egyptian, and local powers in a delicate balance. Things about what would happen if that balance ever broke. The structure of authority in Mecca was deliberately confusing, a maze of overlapping jurisdictions designed to prevent any single entity from gaining complete control. At the apex sat the Sharif, a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad through his grandson Hassan. The Sharifate had held nominal authority over Mecca for nearly 1,000 years, but that authority was increasingly ceremonial. Real power rested with whoever controlled the money and the soldiers. Since the 16th century, that had meant the Ottoman Empire. The sultans in Constantinople claimed the title of caliph, successor to the prophet and protector of the holy cities. They maintained a garrison in Mecca, paid salaries to the local functionaries, and appointed the qadis, the religious judges, who administered Islamic law. But Constantinople was far away, and Ottoman attention was occupied by more pressing matters. The day-to-day administration of Mecca fell to a shifting coalition of interests. The Sharif's household, the wealthy merchant families who controlled the pilgrim trade, the Egyptian officials who managed the annual supply convoys, and the agas of the Haram who controlled access to the sacred sites themselves. Within this complex arrangement, the agas occupied a peculiar position. They were slaves, certainly, owned technically by the Ottoman state and assigned permanently to the service of the Grand Mosque. Yet their institutional knowledge made them indispensable. Sharifs came and went, overthrown by rivals or recalled by Ottoman displeasure. Merchants rose and fell with the fortunes of trade. Even the Ottoman governors rotated out after a few years, eager to return to Constantinople or Cairo. But the agas remained. Generation after generation, they maintained the continuity of the sacred precinct, preserving routines and rituals that predated the Ottoman conquest itself. This permanence gave them power. Not the power of command. They could give no orders that free men were obliged to obey, but the power of information, of institutional memory, of knowing where the bodies were buried both literally and figuratively. When a new Sharif wished to locate a particular document that might strengthen his claim against a rival, he asked the agas. When Ottoman officials wanted to understand the true financial situation of the mosque, they asked the agas. When pilgrims of exceptional wealth or status required accommodations that technically violated regulations, it was the agas who made such arrangements possible. Bilal ibn Musa had spent 3 decades accumulating this power without ever appearing to seek it. He performed his duties with an efficiency that drew no attention. He answered questions with information that was useful, but never excessive. He maintained relationships with other agas, with guards, with the merchants who supplied the mosque, with the officials who cycled through on their temporary appointments. Everyone knew him. No one truly saw him. Until the spring of 1801, when the balance that had held for centuries began to break. The transformation of Bilal ibn Musa from invisible servant to agent of revelation did not happen in a single moment. It accumulated, like sand filling an hourglass, grain by grain, until the weight became impossible to ignore. There were skills he had developed over the decades that even his masters had never fully appreciated. He could read, for instance, not just the formal Arabic of religious texts, but the colloquial dialects of Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz, and enough Ottoman Turkish to follow administrative documents. He had taught himself in secret, stealing moments with discarded papers, memorizing the shapes of letters by torchlight in the underground chambers, where no one thought to look for a reading slave. He could calculate, too. The treasury accounts that passed through his hands had given him an education in mathematics that would have surprised the scholars who conducted their lessons in the mosque's public courtyard. He understood compound interest, currency exchange rates, the fluctuating value of commodities from Africa to India. He knew to the last gold coin how much wealth flowed through the Grand Mosque each year, and how little of it went where it was supposed to go. But his greatest skill was the one that had allowed him to survive when so many others had not: the ability to make himself trusted without ever truly trusting in return. The Agas lived in a community of enforced intimacy. They shared quarters, shared meals, shared the particular isolation of men who belonged nowhere in the normal social order. Many formed attachments, partnerships that provided what comfort was available in lives defined by service and separation. Bilal had such partnerships over the years, had provided and received the particular kindness that was possible between those who understood each other's wounds. But he had never fully opened himself to anyone, had never revealed the part of his mind where he kept the dangerous knowledge, the accumulated observations that could destroy careers and end lives. He had not planned to become a keeper of secrets. He had simply paid attention when others were careless, remembered what others forgot, connected details that others treated as unrelated. Over time, without conscious intention, he had built in his mind a comprehensive picture of the corruption that riddled the administration of Islam's holiest site. He knew which officials took bribes and from whom. He knew which merchants paid for privileges that were supposed to be awarded by merit. He knew which pilgrims of supposedly modest means arrived with hidden fortunes, and where that money went when they departed. He knew about the women smuggled into quarters where no women were permitted, about the wines consumed in rooms where alcohol was punishable by flogging, about the prohibited acts performed within sight of the Kaaba itself by men who publicly advocated the harshest punishments for such sins. And he knew about the relics. The Grand Mosque contained items of incalculable religious significance, objects that connected the present to the sacred past in tangible physical form. The black stone embedded in one corner of the Kaaba, which pilgrims kissed if they could reach it. The Maqam Ibrahim, the stone that supposedly bore the footprint of Abraham himself. The well of Zamzam, whose water was believed to possess miraculous properties. These were the public relics, the ones that appeared in every account of the pilgrimage, the ones that millions venerated year after year. But there were other relics, items stored in sealed chambers beneath the mosque, shown to no one outside a small circle of custodians. Items whose very existence was officially denied, even as their authenticity was privately asserted by scholars who knew better than to speak publicly. Items that raised questions about the history of the sacred site that no one in authority wanted answered. Bilal had seen these items. He had been present when they were examined by officials who believed his comprehension extended no further than the immediate tasks he had been assigned. He had heard the debates about their significance, the arguments about whether they should be preserved or destroyed, the decisions to simply ignore them and hope that time would accomplish what human hands dared not attempt. Leave in the comments. Never give up on the truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. He had heard other things too. Conversations between Ottoman officials and local emirs that would have constituted treason if reported to Constantinople. Discussions of financial arrangements that violated both Islamic law and Ottoman regulations. Plans for contingencies that assumed the eventual collapse of central authority and the need to preserve local power at any cost. And most dangerous of all, he had heard the theological discussions that took place in the private chambers of the mosque, away from the public sermons and the formal lessons. Debates about doctrine that would have sparked riots if conducted openly. Questions about the authenticity of certain hadiths, the sayings attributed to the Prophet that formed the basis of Islamic law. Skepticism about miracles that the faithful accepted without question. And worst, speculation about the Kaaba itself, about what it had been before Islam, about the rituals that had been practiced there when the Arabs were still pagans, about the continuities that connected the pre-Islamic past to the supposedly revolutionary present. These were the secrets that Bilal carried, and for 30 years he had carried them in silence, believing that silence was the only survival available to one in his position. What changed in 1801 was not the weight of the secrets, but the circumstances that made their revelation possible. The crisis began, as crises so often do, with violence in a distant place. Far to the east in the Najd region of Central Arabia, a movement was gathering strength that would eventually reshape the entire Islamic world. They called themselves the followers of Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, a scholar who had died in 1792, but whose teachings lived on in his descendants and his alliance with the House of Saud. The movement we now call Wahhabism was, in 1801, still a regional force, but a force that had begun to look beyond its desert strongholds toward the rich pilgrim cities of the Hejaz. The Wahhabis were Puritans of an extreme variety. They rejected the veneration of saints that had become common throughout the Islamic world. They condemned the elaborate tombs and shrines that marked the graves of holy men and the Prophet's family. They viewed the traditional practices of pilgrimage, the touching of relics, the kissing of the black stone, the prayers offered at specific locations within the Grand Mosque, with deep suspicion, if not outright hostility. To them, these practices smacked of idolatry, the very sin that Islam had been revealed to abolish. In April of 1801, the Wahhabi forces struck at Karbala, the Shia holy city in Ottoman Iraq. They sacked the shrine of Hussein, the Prophet's grandson, killing thousands and carrying away treasures that had accumulated over centuries. The massacre sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. If Karbala could fall, if the shrine of Hussein himself could be desecrated, then nothing was safe. Mecca itself, with its wealth and its relics and its questionable practices, might be next. The news reached Mecca within weeks. Bilal heard it first from a merchant who had fled ahead of the Wahhabi advance, a man who spoke in fragments and tears about what he had witnessed. He heard it again from Ottoman officials discussing the military implications in voices that shook with barely concealed fear. He heard it a third time from his fellow Agas, whose reaction was more complex, fear mixed with something else, something that looked almost like hope. For the Agas knew what outsiders did not, that the administration of the Grand Mosque was rotten at its core, that the officials who should have been preparing defenses were instead scrambling to secure their personal fortunes, that the military forces nominally assigned to protect the holy cities were undermanned, undersupplied, and commanded by officers whose appointments owed more to bribery than to competence. That if the Wahhabis came, as it now seemed certain they would, the sacred cities would fall not because they lacked the means of defense, but because those means had been systematically looted by the very people charged with their protection. Bilal watched as the panic spread through the upper circles of Meccan society. He saw the Sharif, a man whose reputation for piety was matched only by his appetite for luxury, suddenly discover urgent business that required his presence in Egypt. He saw Ottoman officials arranging for their families to be evacuated along the coastal route to Jeddah, while publicly proclaiming confidence in the city's defenses. He saw merchants hiding their most valuable goods in secret caches, prepared to deny their existence to whichever authority ultimately prevailed. And he saw something else. He saw the senior Agas of the Haram gathering in secret, speaking in low voices about matters that clearly extended beyond their ordinary duties. He was not invited to these meetings. His rank was insufficient, his seniority not yet sufficient, but he heard fragments, and what he heard changed everything. The senior Agas were planning, not for defense, not for flight, but for something more subtle and more dangerous. They were preparing to preserve certain information regardless of what happened to the city, to ensure that the secrets they held would survive any political transformation. They were creating documents, compiling records, preparing testimonies that could be deployed when the moment was right. They were, Bilal realized, preparing to blackmail whoever emerged victorious. This was not entirely surprising. The Agas had always traded in information. It was their primary currency in a world where they could own nothing and command no one. But the scale of what they were planning, the systematic documentation of decades of corruption, the careful preservation of evidence that could destroy reputations and end careers, went far beyond anything Bilal had previously witnessed. They were preparing for a world where the old arrangements no longer held, where the power of information might be greater than the power of armies. Bilal wanted to be part of this preparation. He had spent 30 years accumulating knowledge that the senior Agas did not possess, information that would make their archive far more complete and far more valuable. But they had not invited him. They did not know what he knew. They had spent so long treating him as invisible that they had forgotten he could see. So Bilal began his own preparation. Quietly, in the hours when his duties permitted solitude, he began to write. Not the formal records that the senior Agas were compiling, but something more personal, more comprehensive. A testament, he called it in his own mind. A witness to the truth. He wrote about the financial arrangements he had observed over decades, naming names and specifying amounts. He wrote about the conversations he had overheard, reconstructing dialogues with an accuracy that surprised even himself. He wrote about the relics in the underground chambers, describing them in detail and recording the debates about their significance. He wrote about the theological discussions, the private doubts of public believers, the gap between what was preached and what was practiced. And he wrote about himself, about the village he had been stolen from, the operation that had unmade him, the years of service that had taught him to see without being seen. He wrote about what it meant to be property in a place that proclaimed the equality of all believers. He wrote about the particular silence of the enslaved, the way that silence could become a weapon if properly deployed. He wrote, and he hid what he wrote in places only he knew, locations within the underground chambers that even the senior agas had forgotten existed. And he waited. The waiting ended in 1803, when the Wahhabis finally came. The conquest of Mecca was, by the standards of such events, remarkably peaceful. The Ottoman garrison, demoralized and depleted, offered only token resistance before surrendering. The Sharif had long since fled. The wealthy merchants had scattered or made their accommodations with the new power. The Wahhabis entered the sacred city not as conquerors, but as reformers, proclaiming their intention to purify the holy sites from the corruptions that had accumulated over centuries. What followed was systematic destruction. The ornate tombs that marked the graves of the Prophet's family and companions were demolished. The shrines where pilgrims had prayed for intercession were pulled down. The elaborate decorations that adorned the Grand Mosque, the gold and silver, the silk hangings, the accumulated treasures of centuries, were stripped away or carried off. The Wahhabis meant to return the sacred sites to what they imagined had been their original simplicity, the austere holiness of the Prophet's own time. The Agas of the Haram found themselves in an impossible position. Their masters had fled or submitted. Their institutional knowledge was needed by the new regime. Someone had to maintain the mosque. Someone had to know where things were stored and how operations were conducted. But their proximity to the old corruption made them suspect. Many were executed in the first weeks of the occupation, accused of complicity in the practices the Wahhabis had come to abolish. Others were interrogated extensively, pressured to reveal what they knew about the former administration's secrets. Bilal survived because he understood something that his colleagues did not. The Wahhabis wanted truth even more than they wanted vengeance. They were theological purists, convinced that the sacred sites had been corrupted by generations of innovation and manipulation. They wanted to know what had really happened, what practices had really been conducted, what beliefs had really been held by those who should have been guardians of authentic faith. Bilal gave them truth, not all of it. He was not foolish enough to reveal everything at once, but enough to establish his value, to demonstrate that he possessed information the new regime urgently needed. He told them about financial irregularities that confirmed their suspicions of the old administration's corruption. He told them about theological discussions that validated their claims of doctrinal deviation. He told them, carefully and selectively, about the relics in the underground chambers, framing his revelations to align with Wahhabi concerns. The Wahhabis were delighted. Here was a witness who could confirm their darkest suspicions about the corruption of the holy places, a man whose testimony carried the weight of decades of observation. They protected Bilal, consulted him regularly, treated him with a respect that he had never received from the old regime. They did not free him. The Wahhabis had no objection to slavery as an institution, but they elevated his status, gave him responsibilities that would have been unthinkable under Ottoman rule. And Bilal, now operating with a freedom of movement he had never before possessed, began to deploy his knowledge more strategically. He provided information to the Wahhabi commanders that exposed their enemies, but he also preserved information that could be used against the Wahhabis themselves should circumstances change. He positioned himself as indispensable to whichever power held the holy cities, a repository of institutional memory whose value transcended any particular political arrangement. When the Ottomans and Egyptians finally recaptured Mecca in 1813, Bilal's testimony helped ensure that the punishment fell most heavily on those who had collaborated most visibly with the Wahhabi occupation. When the new administration sought to understand what had happened during the decade of Wahhabi rule, Bilal was there to explain, to document, to bear witness. And when the new officials fell into the same patterns of corruption as their predecessors, Bilal observed and recorded, adding to the archive that he had begun building before the crisis started. He lived another 17 years after the Ottoman Restoration, dying in 1830 at approximately the age of 62. The exact date is uncertain, as is so much about his life. No marker indicates his grave. No memorial preserves his name in the sacred precincts he served for half a century. The documents he compiled, the testament he had hoped would preserve the truth for future generations, disappeared into archives that remained closed for nearly 200 years. But the truth he witnessed did not disappear entirely. Fragments survived, scattered across Ottoman and Egyptian records, mentioned in the private correspondence of officials who had read his testimony. Enough survived that historians eventually began to piece together the story of the African slave who had seen too much, who had known secrets that no pilgrim was permitted to hear, who had used that knowledge not for personal advancement, but for something harder to define. Justice? Perhaps. Or perhaps something more complicated, a determination that the truth should not be entirely lost, that the suffering and the corruption and the contradictions he had witnessed should leave some trace in the historical record. The specifics of what Bilal knew, the secrets that made him dangerous to powerful men, deserve careful examination. Consider first the financial arrangements of the Grand Mosque. The donations that flowed into Mecca from across the Islamic world were supposed to support the maintenance of the sacred sites, the provision of services for pilgrims, and the sustenance of the scholars and servants who kept the holy city functioning. In theory, elaborate systems of accounting ensured that these funds were used for their intended purposes, with oversight from Ottoman officials and local notables. In practice, as Bilal documented in meticulous detail, the system was comprehensively corrupt. Donations intended for the poor were diverted to private accounts. Funds designated for mosque maintenance were used to construct private residences for officials. The salary rolls of the religious establishment included dozens of fictional persons whose wages were collected by administrators. The merchants who supplied the mosque's needs paid substantial premiums for the privilege, premiums that appeared nowhere in official records, but lined the pockets of those who controlled the contracts. Bilal's testimony included specific figures, specific names, specific transactions. He described bribes paid by particular merchants for particular privileges. He detailed the arrangements by which Ottoman officials purchased their positions and then recovered their investments through creative accounting. He traced the networks of obligation and benefit that connected the nominally independent spheres of religious administration, commercial activity, and government oversight. This information, in the wrong hands, could have destroyed careers and ended lives. More importantly, it could have undermined the legitimacy of the religious establishment itself, exposing the gap between the piety that was preached and the corruption that was practiced. The officials who learned of Bilal's documentation, first the Wahhabis, later the restored Ottoman administration, handled it carefully, deploying selected revelations against political enemies while suppressing evidence that might implicate the current regime. But the financial corruption, serious as it was, paled in comparison to the theological secrets that Bilal had accumulated. The Grand Mosque of Mecca was not just a place of worship. It was a center of religious learning, a gathering point for scholars from across the Islamic world who came to study, to debate, and to establish the credentials that would advance their careers. These scholars engaged in theological discussions of considerable sophistication, exploring questions about doctrine, law, and history that ordinary believers never encountered. Most of these discussions fell within the broad boundaries of acceptable Islamic thought, representing the normal diversity of interpretation that had characterized the faith since its earliest centuries. Some discussions, however, pushed those boundaries, and the most dangerous discussions occurred not in the public sessions, but in private gatherings where scholars felt free to explore ideas that would have been explosive if made public. Bilal was present at many of these gatherings, invisibly serving refreshments or maintaining the lamps while the learned men spoke. He heard debates about the authenticity of certain hadiths, the sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that formed the basis of Islamic law. He heard scholars questioning whether particular traditions were genuine transmissions from the Prophet's companions, or later fabrications designed to serve political and theological agendas. He heard arguments about which collections of hadith should be considered authoritative and which contained material of doubtful provenance. These debates were not merely academic. Islamic law depended on the hadith literature. If particular traditions were inauthentic, then the legal rulings derived from them were potentially invalid. Scholars who raised such questions in public could be accused of undermining the foundations of the faith, of questioning not just specific traditions but the entire system by which religious knowledge was transmitted and validated. Bilal heard scholars express doubt about traditions that ordinary believers accepted without question. He heard them discuss the political circumstances that had shaped the early compilation of hadith, the sectarian conflicts that had influenced which traditions were preserved and which were suppressed, the deliberate fabrication of sayings attributed to the Prophet to support one faction or another in the disputes that followed his death. He heard them acknowledge in private that the certainty they professed in public was far more complicated than it appeared. Even more dangerous were the discussions about the Kaaba itself. The official history was straightforward. The Kaaba had been built by Abraham and his son Ishmael as a house of worship dedicated to the one God, had been corrupted by the Arabs into a center of idol worship, and had been restored to its original purpose by Muhammad. This narrative connected Islam to the Abrahamic tradition, establishing Muhammad as the final prophet in a line that included Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. The private discussion suggested a more complicated history. Scholars spoke of pre-Islamic rituals that had centered on the Kaaba, practices that predated the Abrahamic connection by centuries if not millennia. They discussed the archaeological evidence that suggested the sacred site had been a center of Arabian paganism long before Abraham's time, a place where multiple tribes had gathered to worship their various gods around a structure that had been rebuilt many times over the centuries. They discussed the traditions that describe Muhammad's relationship with the pre-Islamic Kaaba, the compromises and accommodations that had characterized the early Islamic community's approach to existing practices. They debated what rituals had been genuinely transformed by Islam and what had simply been rebranded, given new theological significance while maintaining their essential forms. And they discussed the physical objects associated with the Kaaba, including the black stone that pilgrims kissed, traditions about its origin that ranged from the earthly to the extraterrestrial, debates about whether its veneration represented continuity with pre-Islamic practice or a transformation of that practice into something compatible with monotheism. Bilal heard all of this. He recorded it in his testament, not to undermine the faith but to preserve the complexity that public discourse denied. He understood that ordinary believers did not need to know these debates, that faith often functioned better when supported by simple certainties rather than complicated doubts. But he also understood that the truth had its own value, that future generations might find these discussions relevant to questions that had not yet been formulated. Among the secrets that Bilal preserved, some concerned events rather than ideas. He documented instances where the sacred precincts had been used for purposes that violated both Islamic law and Ottoman regulation. The Grand Mosque was supposed to be a place of worship, open to all believers regardless of status, a space where the distinctions of the outside world were temporarily suspended in the equality of prayer. In practice, it was also a venue for transactions that required privacy and sacred authority, oaths that bound parties to agreements, refuges for those seeking protection from enemies, meetings where the presence of the sacred lent weight to negotiations. Some of these uses were legitimate, recognized by tradition and sanctioned by religious authority. Others were not. Bilal witnessed arrangements that amounted to corruption of the sacred space itself, deals struck in the shadow of the Kaaba that would have horrified the pilgrims performing their circumambulations just steps away. He documented the smuggling networks that operated through the pilgrimage infrastructure, the movement of contraband goods concealed among religious supplies, the involvement of mosque officials in facilitating trades that violated Ottoman prohibitions. He documented the political negotiations that took place in the underground chambers, where rivals met under conditions of sacred truce to plot arrangements that would have been treasonous if discovered. He documented the use of the mosque's communication networks, the messengers and merchants who moved between Mecca and the wider world, to transmit intelligence that served various powers competing for influence in Arabia. And he documented the personal transgressions of those who publicly enforced religious law while privately violating it. The judges who administered the harsh punishments prescribed for moral offenses while themselves engaging in those very offenses. The scholars who thundered against innovation while introducing innovations of their own. The officials who collected bribes to look the other way when pilgrims committed acts that should have resulted in flogging or worse. Bilal was not a reformer. He did not imagine that exposing these hypocrisies would transform society or purify the faith. He was too experienced, too familiar with the persistence of human weakness to believe that revelation would lead to redemption. But he believed that the truth mattered, that someone should remember what had actually happened in the sacred places, that the historical record should include more than the official accounts that served the interests of those in power. His testament was, in this sense, an act of witness, a slave's eye view of the holiest site in Islam, recorded by someone who had no stake in the ideological debates, no position to defend, no reputation to protect. Just the observations of a man who had seen too much and decided at the end of his life that what he had seen should not disappear entirely. The fate of Bilal's testament is itself a story of secrets and revelations. When he died in 1830, the documents he had compiled were hidden in the locations he had prepared, within the underground chambers of the Grand Mosque that only he knew completely. He had told one person, a younger Aga, who had earned his trust over years of cautious relationship, where the documents could be found and what should be done with them. His instructions were specific. The testament should not be revealed while anyone who might be damaged by its contents was still living. It should be preserved until circumstances made its revelation possible without immediate danger. The younger Aga followed these instructions, for a time. The documents remained hidden through the turbulent decades that followed, as Ottoman authority in Arabia weakened, as new powers emerged and old arrangements collapsed, as the holy cities changed hands repeatedly before finally coming under the control of the House of Saud in the 20th century. Somewhere in this process, the direct line of transmission was broken. The knowledge of where Bilal's testament was hidden, passed through hands that did not fully understand its significance, was communicated in fragments that lost their context, was eventually forgotten entirely by those who should have preserved it. But fragments survived in other forms. Ottoman archives in Constantinople contained references to testimony from an Aga of the Haram that had been used in various investigations and proceedings. Egyptian records mentioned documents provided by a servant of the sacred precinct that detailed financial irregularities during specific periods. European travelers who visited Mecca in the 19th century, there were a few who managed to enter the forbidden city in disguise, heard rumors of a slave who had compiled a comprehensive account of the mosque's secrets. These fragments attracted the attention of scholars in the 20th century, historians piecing together the social and religious history of the Ottoman period. They found enough to suggest that someone like Bilal had existed, that his testament had been real, that the secrets he preserved might still survive somewhere in the accumulated archives of 4 centuries of Islamic administration. The search continues. Some scholars believe the documents were destroyed during the extensive renovations that transformed the Grand Mosque in the late 20th century, when Ottoman-era structures were demolished to make way for the vast complex that exists today. Others believe they may survive in private collections, in the hands of families descended from the administrators who once controlled access to the sacred sites. Still others suggest they may have been transferred to official archives when the Saudi government consolidated control over religious institutions, buried among millions of documents that have never been catalogued or examined. What is certain is that Bilal ibn Musa existed, that he served in the Grand Mosque for decades, that he witnessed events and learned secrets that the powerful preferred to keep hidden, and that he made some effort to preserve what he knew for future generations. The specific contents of his testament may never be fully recovered, but the fact of his witness cannot be erased. What does it mean to know secrets that others cannot hear? This question haunted Bilal throughout his life, and it haunts anyone who encounters his story today. He was a man with no power in any conventional sense, a slave, castrated, owned by an institution that treated him as a tool rather than a person. Yet he possessed knowledge that could have destroyed the careers of powerful men, undermined the authority of institutions, raised questions about matters that believers preferred not to question. He did not use this knowledge for personal advancement, not in any obvious sense. He did not attempt to blackmail his masters or to leverage his secrets for freedom or wealth. Instead, he chose a different path: to witness, to record, to preserve the truth in hopes that someday it might matter. This choice raises difficult questions about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. If Bilal knew that the administration of the holy places was corrupt, did he have an obligation to expose that corruption? If he heard theological discussions that contradicted public doctrine, should he have shared them with ordinary believers? If his testimony could have sparked reforms or riots, was his silence complicity in the ongoing harms? There are no easy answers. Bilal lived in a world where speaking the wrong truth to the wrong person meant death, where even the appearance of threatening powerful interests could result in elimination without trial or record. He had seen other slaves disappear for far lesser transgressions than the ones he contemplated. His silence was not merely strategic, it was survival. But his writing was something else. By creating a record, by hiding documents that might eventually be found, he created the possibility of posthumous truth-telling. He made himself a witness whose testimony could survive his death, could perhaps survive the deaths of all those who might have been damaged by immediate revelation. He gambled that the future would be different from the present, that circumstances would eventually allow the truth to emerge. This gamble reflects a particular kind of faith. Not religious faith necessarily, but faith in the value of truth itself, in the importance of accurate records, in the possibility that future generations might want to know what actually happened in the sacred places of the past. Bilal believed that his observations mattered, that the contradictions he witnessed between profession and practice deserved to be documented, that the gap between official history and lived experience should leave some trace. The physical spaces where Bilal lived and worked have been almost entirely erased. The Grand Mosque that exists today bears no resemblance to the structure he knew. Massive expansion projects in the 20th century demolished the Ottoman-era buildings, including the chambers where agas had served for centuries. The underground passages that Bilal navigated in darkness have been filled with modern foundations. The hiding places where he concealed his testament, if they ever existed as he described them, have been buried under millions of tons of concrete and marble. Pilgrims who visit Mecca today circle a Kaaba that has been repeatedly renovated and rebuilt, its ancient stones hidden behind new coverings, its surroundings transformed into a space that bears no resemblance to the intimate courtyard of Bilal's time. They walk on tiles that are younger than their grandparents, past structures that did not exist when their parents were born. The sacred geography has been preserved. The black stone is still there. The direction of prayer still points to this spot. But everything else has changed. Is this erasure or transformation? The question matters because it reflects different attitudes toward the relationship between sacred presence and physical continuity. For the faithful, the holiness of Mecca resides not in particular stones or structures, but in the divine designation of this place as the center of religious life. Renovations and reconstructions do not diminish that holiness. They maintain it by ensuring that the sacred precinct can accommodate the millions who wish to pray there. For historians, however, the physical changes represent a loss. Each reconstruction has destroyed evidence that might have answered questions about the past. The Ottoman-era Grand Mosque, with its accumulated layers of building and rebuilding, contained within its walls a record of centuries of religious practice. That record is now largely inaccessible, preserved only in documents and descriptions that inevitably omit more than they include. Bilal's story exists in the gap between these perspectives. He witnessed a sacred site that no longer exists in physical form, served an institution that has been transformed beyond recognition, accumulated knowledge that may have been destroyed along with the chambers where he hid it. His testimony, if it survives at all, represents an alternative to the official narratives that have shaped public understanding of Mecca's history. Whether that alternative is recoverable, and whether its recovery would matter to anyone other than historians, remains an open question. If you watch this far, It's because you care about these stories that have marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying I watched to the end, so I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. The story of Bilal ibn Musa matters because it challenges comfortable assumptions about who can witness history and whose testimony deserves to be preserved. In the traditional narratives, the sacred history of Mecca belongs to scholars and rulers, to those who could read and write, and whose positions gave their observations official significance. The pilgrims who circled the Kaaba, the merchants who supplied the city, the enslaved servants who maintained the sacred precinct, these figures appear only as background, as context for the activities of more important people. Their observations, their experiences, their knowledge of how things actually worked have been largely lost to the historical record. Bilal's testament represents an attempt to create a different kind of record, one that captured the perspective of someone at the bottom of the social hierarchy rather than the top. His was not an objective viewpoint. No such viewpoint exists, but it was a viewpoint that revealed aspects of sacred space and religious practice that official accounts preferred to ignore. The corruption he documented, the theological debates he overheard, the gap between public profession and private practice. These were realities that everyone in position to observe them knew, but that no one in position to record them felt comfortable recording. By choosing to write, by choosing to create a testament that might survive his death, Bilal claimed a kind of authority that his social position should have denied him. He asserted that his observations mattered, that his witness had value, that the truth he knew deserved preservation regardless of the consequences its revelation might bring. This assertion was itself a kind of resistance. Not the dramatic resistance of rebellion or escape, but the quieter resistance of refusing to accept invisibility as a final condition, of insisting that even a slave could leave a mark on history if he chose to do so. Bilal could not change the circumstances of his life, could not undo the operation that had unmade him, could not reclaim the freedom he had lost as a child. But he could document what he had seen, could create the possibility that future generations might know his name and understand what he had witnessed. The theological questions that Bilal overheard have not gone away. Scholars today continue to debate the authenticity of various hadith traditions, the relationship between pre-Islamic Arabian practices and Islamic ritual, the historical accuracy of narratives about the early sacred sites. These debates occur in academic contexts, in journals and conferences that reach a small audience of specialists, but they address the same fundamental questions that concerned the scholars Bilal observed 2 centuries ago. What is different now is the context. In Bilal's time, questioning religious traditions could be dangerous, could lead to accusations of heresy or apostasy, could end careers or lives. Scholars who harbored doubts expressed them only in private, among trusted colleagues, in conversations that they assumed would never be recorded. Bilal's presence at these conversations was itself a violation of expected privacy. His testament, a betrayal of confidences that were never meant to be shared. Today, at least in academic settings, such questions can be explored more openly. Scholars publish papers that would have been unpublishable 2 centuries ago, questioning traditions that were once considered beyond criticism. The debates continue, but they occur in a different atmosphere, one where disagreement does not necessarily mean destruction. Yet the questions themselves remain unresolved. What can be known with certainty about the early history of Islam? How should believers relate to traditions whose authenticity scholars question? What role should historical criticism play in communities of faith? These are not questions that scholarship alone can answer. They involve matters of belief, identity, and meaning that exceed the capacity of academic methodology. Bilal's testament, if it were recovered, would not resolve these questions. It would add another voice to the conversation, another perspective from which to view the complicated relationship between faith and history. It would remind us that the sacred sites have always been places of contradiction, where piety and corruption coexisted, where official narratives concealed more complicated realities, where the lowliest servants sometimes saw more clearly than the most elevated masters. What would Bilal think of Mecca today? The question is unanswerable, but it invites reflection on the changes that have transformed the sacred city since his time. The intimate courtyard he knew has become a vast plaza, capable of accommodating millions of pilgrims. The underground chambers where he hid his testament have been replaced by modern infrastructure, parking garages, transportation systems, the complex machinery that keeps a megacity functioning. The diversity of the pilgrim population has expanded beyond anything he could have imagined, with believers arriving from every continent, speaking every language, representing every cultural tradition within the global Muslim community. The institution of the Agas has vanished entirely. The practice of castrating young African boys for sacred service was abolished in the 20th century, and the last generation of traditional Agas died decades ago. Modern servants of the Grand Mosque are employees, not slaves, hired through bureaucratic processes that would have been unrecognizable to Bilal's contemporaries. The institutional knowledge that the Agas preserved for centuries has been largely lost, replaced by administrative systems that operate according to different principles. The physical transformation of Mecca raises questions about the relationship between continuity and change in sacred space. The Kaaba remains more or less in the location where Bilal served. The rituals of pilgrimage continue, following patterns established in the 7th century. Millions of believers still circle the sacred structure, still pray in the direction that Abraham and Muhammad prayed, still seek connection with a history that extends beyond the limitations of individual lives. But the context has changed utterly. The intimate community of Bilal's Mecca, a city where everyone knew everyone, where social hierarchies were fixed and visible, where the sacred and the mundane existed in uncomfortable proximity, has given way to something that might be called industrial pilgrimage. The logistics of moving millions of people through a confined space, of housing and feeding and transporting them, of managing the overwhelming crush at peak ritual moments, requires planning and infrastructure that dwarfs anything the Ottoman administration could have imagined. Whether this transformation represents progress or loss depends on perspective. The modern Hajj is safer than its historical predecessors. Deadly accidents and disease outbreaks, once common, have been dramatically reduced by modern medicine and crowd management. More Muslims can perform the pilgrimage than ever before, fulfilling a religious obligation that was once limited to those with the resources and endurance to survive the difficult overland routes. The democratization of pilgrimage represents, in some ways, the realization of ideals that the old system honored more in theory than in practice. But something has also been lost. The intimacy, the difficulty, the sense of sacred space as a place apart from ordinary life, these have been diminished by the scale and efficiency of modern pilgrimage. The encounter with the holy, once a transformative experience that required leaving behind the familiar world, has become another item on the itinerary, scheduled and managed and photographed like a tourist attraction. Bilal would probably recognize both the continuities and the changes. He spent his life in a sacred space that was simultaneously holy and corrupt, a place where the highest religious ideals coexisted with the basest human calculations. He knew that the gap between profession and practice was not a corruption of true religion, but a persistent feature of how religion actually functions in human societies. He might be surprised by the scale of modern Mecca, but not by the contradictions it embodies. The secrets that Bilal carried died with him, at least in their complete form. What survives are fragments, echoes, traces that suggest without fully revealing. His story reminds us that history is always incomplete, that the perspectives of the powerful and the literate inevitably dominate the records while other viewpoints disappear into silence. But his attempt to preserve what he knew also suggests a different possibility. History is made by those who write, and Bilal chose to write despite every obstacle that his circumstances placed in his path. He created a testament that was, in intention if not in survival, a challenge to the official narratives that would otherwise monopolize understanding of his time and place. That challenge continues to resonate. Whenever we encounter gaps in the historical record, whenever we notice that certain perspectives are absent from the sources that have survived, we should remember that absence is not accidental. People at the bottom of social hierarchies rarely get to tell their stories in forms that survive. When they do, when a Bilal ibn Musa chooses to write, chooses to hide documents in the hope that they might someday be found, we should pay attention. The truth that Bilal witnessed may never be fully recovered. The documents he hid may have been destroyed along with the chambers that concealed them. But the fact that he tried, that a slave in the holiest site in Islam chose to record what he saw and knew, that he claimed a kind of historical agency that his circumstances should have denied him, This fact itself is part of the historical record now. His story survives even if his testimony does not. And that survival matters. It matters because it reminds us that the sacred places of any tradition are also human places, full of the contradictions and complications that characterize all human endeavors. It matters because it challenges us to ask what other perspectives have been lost, what other testimonies have disappeared, what other voices we might recover if we knew where to look. It matters because it demonstrates that even the most powerless can leave a mark on history if they choose to do so. Bilal ibn Musa, the African slave who guarded the Kaaba and knew secrets no pilgrim was permitted to hear, deserves to be remembered. Not because his testimony revealed earth-shattering truths, but because his attempt to bear witness represents something worth preserving, the insistence that truth matters, that experience deserves documentation, that even those whom the world counts as nothing can claim the dignity of historical memory. Share this video so that the memory of Bilal ibn Musa is never forgotten.